Imagine a line drawn in the dirt. A simple, crude barrier of wooden posts standing 19 feet from a wall that's meant to keep you in. They called it the deadline. If any part of your body crossed it, your hand reaching for a dropped crumb, your foot slipping in the mud, you were shot dead. No warning, no trial. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a prison. This was Andersonville. And the deadline was the most merciful way to die there. So how did this happen? How did a place of such unimaginable horror come to exist? To understand Andersonville, you first have to understand the desperation of the Confederacy in 1864. The war was lost, though they wouldn't admit it yet. The Union blockade was strangling their supply lines, their farms were barren, their railroads were destroyed, and their armies were starving. Compounding this, the prisoner exchange system, a gentleman's agreement to swap captives, had completely broken down. General Ulysses S. Grant had stopped it. He knew the Union could replace its men. The Confederacy could not. Suddenly, both sides were left with a massive, unforeseen problem. Tens of thousands of prisoners of war they had no way to house, no way to feed, and no way to control. The Confederacy, already on its knees, had to find a solution. And their solution was a 26-acre field in southwest Georgia. The location was chosen for what seemed like sound reasons. It was deep in the heart of the Confederacy, far from the front lines and safe from Union cavalry raids. It had a steady supply of fresh water from a creek called Sweetwater Branch. It was next to a railroad, making it easy to transport prisoners. And it was surrounded by dense pine forests, providing a ready source of timber to build the stockade. Captain William Sidney Winder, son of the Confederate official in charge of prisoners, selected the site. He saw security. He saw resources. What he didn't see, or chose to ignore, was that he was choosing a site that would become a death sentence for thousands. The very things that made it seem ideal would soon become instruments of torture. Construction began in January 1864. Using slave labor, the Confederate Army cleared a rectangular patch of land, initially just over 16 acres. They felled the tall Georgia pines, stripped them of their branches, and sunk them 5 feet into the ground to create a towering stockade wall, 15 feet high. There were no barracks, no kitchens, no hospital. It was, in the simplest terms, a giant open-air pen designed to hold 10,000 men. Sentry boxes, which the prisoners would call pigeon roosts, were perched atop the walls every 30 yards. The guards were mostly old men and young boys, too infirm or too green for the front lines, but they were armed and their orders were clear. The prison, officially named Camp Sumter, opened for business in February 1864. The first Union prisoners arrived, stepping off the train and marching into the vast, empty enclosure, likely wondering where the buildings were. They had no idea they were walking into hell. The camp was designed for 10,000 men. By June, just 4 months after it opened, it held 20,000. By August, over 33,000 men were crammed inside an expanded 26-acre space. That's less than 30 square feet per man, not enough room to lie down. The trickle of prisoners had become a torrent. They came from the wilderness, from Spotsylvania, from Cold Harbor. Battle-hardened soldiers captured and herded onto trains arrived day after day, week after week. The Confederate authorities were completely overwhelmed. The single-track railroad couldn't bring in enough food for the guards, let alone the prisoners. The administrative system was a chaotic mess. Men arrived, were shoved through the gates, and simply disappeared into the mass of humanity inside. They became anonymous, lost in a swelling ocean of misery. The one feature that was supposed to sustain life at Andersonville
became its most efficient killer, Sweetwater Branch. The creek flowed directly through the camp. It was the only source of water for drinking, for bathing, for everything. But the camp was built on a slope. The Confederate Guards camp, the cookhouse, and the bakery were all built upstream. Their waste, their garbage, all of it washed directly into the prisoners' water supply. Inside the stockade, with no latrines, the banks of the creek became the camp's sewer. The stream, once clean and clear, became a thick, vile morass of human filth, grease, and garbage. It was a breeding ground for bacteria, for typhoid, for dysentery. To drink from it was to risk a slow, agonizing death. But not to drink from it was to die of thirst even faster. This was the impossible choice every man faced every single day. The official daily ration was a quarter pound of cornmeal and either a third of a pound of bacon or 1 pound of beef. It rarely ever happened. What they usually got was a small cup of coarse, uncooked cornmeal, often ground with the cobs still in it, creating sharp, indigestible husks. Sometimes they'd get a handful of cowpeas, often riddled with insects. There were no vegetables, no fruit, no way to combat the inevitable onset of scurvy. The cornmeal, if they could cook it at all over tiny, precious fires, would cause debilitating digestive issues. Men starved slowly. They became living skeletons, obsessed with a single thought: food. They would hunt for rats. They would chew on shoe leather. They would trade their last possessions, a button, a family photo, for a single sweet potato. The gnawing hunger was a constant, maddening torture that eroded their bodies and their minds. When the Confederates cleared the land for the stockade, they cut down every single tree. There was no natural shelter, nothing to block the brutal Georgia sun in the summer, which sent temperatures soaring over 100 degrees. Nothing to shield them from the cold, drenching rains in the spring and fall. The prisoners were left to their own devices. They fashioned pitiful tents called shebangs from scraps of blankets, old coats, and any stick they could find. These offered little protection. When it rained, the camp, which was situated in a natural basin, would flood, turning the ground into a foul, stinking swamp of mud and human waste. Men who were too sick to move could and did drown in their own filth. Exposure was a constant threat, weakening their already ravaged bodies and leaving them vulnerable to the diseases that stalked every corner of the camp. With no sanitation, poisoned water, and near starvation rations, disease was not a risk, it was a certainty. Dysentery, which the men called the flux, was rampant, a bloody, dehydrating sickness that killed thousands. Scurvy, from the lack of vitamin C, was everywhere. Men's gums would turn black and swell, their teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen, and their limbs would bloat to grotesque sizes. Typhoid fever, spread by lice, burned through the population. But perhaps the most feared affliction was hospital gangrene. A small cut, an insect bite, could become infected. The flesh would rot, turning black and green, emitting a horrifying stench and eating away at a man's body until he died. The so-called hospital was a nightmare in itself, a few squalid tents with no medicine, where men were sent not to be cured, but simply to die away from the main population. Presiding over this inferno was one of the most controversial figures of the Civil War, Captain Henry Wirz. A Swiss immigrant, Wirz was a physician by trade who had been wounded in battle, leaving his right arm shattered and in constant pain. He was appointed commandant of the prison in March 1864. To the prisoners, he was a monster. They wrote in their diaries of his cruelty, his profane tirades, his seeming indifference to their suffering. They accused him of arbitrarily ordering men shot, of withholding rations as punishment.
But the story is more complex. Wirz's defenders argue he was a scapegoat, a mid-level officer handed an impossible situation. He repeatedly wrote to his superiors in Richmond, begging for more food, more medicine, more supplies. His pleas were ignored. The collapsing Confederacy had nothing to give. Was he a sadistic tyrant or a frustrated bureaucrat trapped in a system that had completely failed? The answer likely lies somewhere in between.
In a place with no hope, no rules, and no guards on the inside, the worst of human nature began to surface. A brutal gang of prisoners formed, known as the Andersonville Raiders. Composed of the strongest and most ruthless men, they preyed on their fellow prisoners, especially the new arrivals who might still have something of value, a good coat, a few dollars, a watch. They would beat, rob, and even murder with impunity. For months they ruled the camp through terror. The vast majority of prisoners, weakened by hunger and disease, were too terrified to fight back. It was a war within a war, a complete breakdown of the social contract. Your biggest threat wasn't just the guards and the towers, but the man lying next to you in the filth. But even in the depths of Andersonville, the human spirit for justice flickered. A countergroup began to form, a vigilante police force that came to be known as the Regulators. Led by a prisoner named Peter Big Pete McCullough, they organized in secret. They identified the leaders of the Raiders. Then one day, with the tacit approval of Captain Wirz, who threw them some clubs, they struck. They moved through the camp in a coordinated sweep, capturing the stunned Raiders. It was a swift, brutal, and effective coup. The balance of power inside the stockade had shifted. What happened next was extraordinary. The Regulators held a formal trial. They selected a judge and a jury of their fellow prisoners. The accused Raiders were given a chance to defend themselves. Evidence was presented. In the end, dozens were found guilty of various crimes. Most were forced to run a gauntlet where they were beaten by the very men they had terrorized. But for the 6 ringleaders, the sentence was death. A gallows was built inside the prison. On July 11, 1864, before a silent audience of nearly 20,000 of their fellow captives, the 6 leaders of the Andersonville Raiders were hanged. For a brief moment, order and justice had been restored to the most lawless place in America, not by the Confederates, but by the prisoners themselves. In August of 1864, during the peak of the suffering, something remarkable happened. A violent thunderstorm lashed the camp. Lightning struck the ground inside the stockade, and from that spot, a spring of fresh, clean water began to flow. To the prisoners who were dying from the polluted water of Sweetwater Branch, it was a miracle, a sign from God. They called it Providence Spring. It provided a vital source of clean drinking water and a much-needed boost to their shattered morale. For men who had been given every reason to despair, it was a tangible symbol of hope, a small mercy in a merciless place. That spring still flows at Andersonville today. Despite the capture of the Raiders and the appearance of Providence Spring, the dying continued unabated. The peak of mortality was August 1864. In that one month, nearly 3,000 men died. That's 100 men every single day, 1 man every 15 minutes. The bodies were collected by fellow prisoners, carried to the gate, and laid out in rows. They were loaded onto wagons, taken to a nearby field, and buried shoulder to shoulder in long, shallow trenches without coffins. A single prisoner, Dorrance Atwater, was tasked with keeping the death register. He secretly made his own copy, smuggling it out at the end of the war, providing the only way for thousands of families to ever know what happened to their loved ones.
For most of the war, the true horror of Andersonville was unknown to the Northern public. Rumors circulated, but the reality was too shocking to be believed. That changed as the war ended and the first prisoners were exchanged or liberated. They told their stories to a horrified press. Then came the photographs. These images of living skeletons, men reduced to skin and bone, with vacant eyes staring out from hollowed skulls, were published in newspapers and magazines across the country. They brought the reality of Andersonville into every Northern home. The public was enraged. They had seen the cost of battle, but this was something different. This was seen as systematic, inhuman cruelty, and they demanded someone be held accountable. In May 1865, a month after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the war was over. Union forces, specifically the 4th U.S. Cavalry, arrived at Andersonville. The soldiers who rode through those gates were hardened veterans. They had seen the worst of combat, but nothing could prepare them for what they found inside. They were met with a scene from a nightmare. Thousands of spectral figures, barely recognizable as human, stumbled towards them. The stench of death and disease was overwhelming. One Union surgeon wrote, "I have been on many a battlefield, but never did I see such a sight as I saw in that stockade." The liberators worked tirelessly, moving the sickest men out, providing food and medical care. But for many, it was too late. They had survived the prison, only to die in the arms of their rescuers, their bodies too broken to recover. The nation cried out for vengeance, and their anger focused on one man, Captain Henry Wirz. He was arrested and taken to Washington, D.C. to stand trial before a military tribunal. The charges were conspiracy to impair the lives of Union prisoners and murder in violation of the laws and customs of war. The trial became a media sensation. Over 150 witnesses, mostly former prisoners, testified. They told horrific stories of cruelty, starvation, and murder, all laid at Wirz's feet. The prosecution, led by Judge Advocate General Norton Parker Chipman, painted Wirz as a demon, personally responsible for every death in the camp. Wirz's defense was simple. He was following orders. He argued that he did the best he could with the non-existent resources provided by his government. His lawyers pointed out that the Confederate soldiers guarding the prison were themselves on meager rations. They argued that the true culprits were the men at the top of the Confederate government and the broken supply system of a dying nation. But the country wasn't interested in nuance. They needed a villain. General Winder, Wirz's superior and arguably more responsible for the overall policy, had conveniently died of a heart attack. Jefferson Davis was imprisoned, but trying him was politically complex. Wirz was the perfect target. He was the man on the ground, the face of the prison, and his foreign accent made him an easy other to blame. The outcome of the trial was never really in doubt. Captain Henry Wirz was found guilty. He was sentenced to be hanged. On November 10th, 1865, he was led to the gallows. It is said that he was offered a pardon in exchange for testimony implicating Confederate President Jefferson Davis, but he refused. As he stood on the scaffold, the crowd below chanted, "Wirz, remember Andersonville." His last words were reportedly, "I am innocent of these charges. I have done only my duty." Then the trapdoor sprung. Henry Wirz became the only Confederate official to be tried, convicted, and executed for war crimes committed during the Civil War. While Wirz's trial was underway, a national effort began to reclaim the dignity of the men who died at Andersonville. A former prisoner, Dorrance Atwater, with his secretly copied death register, and Clara Barton, the future founder of the American Red Cross, led an expedition to the site. They worked for weeks under the hot Georgia sun. Using Atwater's list, they were able to identify all but a few hundred of the nearly 13,000 graves. They replaced the simple numbered stakes with proper marked headstones. The field of anonymous trenches was transformed into Andersonville National Cemetery. It was a monumental task of remembrance, ensuring that the men who perished there would not be forgotten. It's crucial to note that suffering in Civil War prisons was not exclusive to the South. Union prisons were also horrific places. Camp Elmira in New York, nicknamed Hellmira, had a death rate of nearly 25%, comparable to Andersonville's 29%. At Camp Douglas in Chicago, Confederate prisoners died from freezing temperatures, disease, and malnutrition. The key difference, and what made Andersonville so infamous, was one of intent versus incompetence. While conditions in northern prisons were atrocious, the North had the resources, the food, the medicine, the lumber to do better. Their failure was one of will and organization. The Confederacy, by 1864, had almost nothing. Their failure was one of total systemic collapse. This doesn't excuse the horror, but it does complicate the narrative of simple, one-sided villainy. For the men who survived, the ordeal was never truly over. They went home with bodies broken by disease and starvation. Many would suffer from chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. But the physical scars were often less damaging than the psychological ones. They were haunted by what they had seen and done to survive. They suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The memories of the deadline, the taste of the poisoned water, the faces of their friends who didn't make it, these things never left them. Andersonville was a wound on the nation's soul, but for the survivors, it was a deeply personal and permanent trauma. Today, Andersonville is a national historic site. It serves as a memorial not just to the men who died there, but to all American prisoners of war throughout the nation's history. People walk the grounds where the stockade once stood, trying to comprehend the scale of the suffering that took place on that very soil. They visit the cemetery, a silent, orderly city of the dead. It is a somber, powerful place. It forces us to confront one of the darkest chapters of American history, not to assign blame, but to understand the profound human cost of war and the terrifying speed at which civilization can collapse. The truth of Andersonville is that it wasn't the product of a single evil man. It was the product of 1,000 failures. A failure of logistics, a failure of leadership, a failure of resources, and ultimately, a failure of humanity. It represents the brutal endpoint of a nation at war with itself, where desperation and chaos overwhelmed any sense of decency. The story isn't just about the depths of human cruelty, but also about the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the men who formed the regulators, the miracle of Providence Spring, the simple act of sharing a crumb of food. Andersonville reminds us that history is not a simple story of good versus evil. It's a complex, painful, and deeply human tragedy. What do you think? Was Captain Wirz a monster, or was he a scapegoat for a failed system? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.